Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Hey Man, It's Okay. I am Sky, and I'm joined here with my new co-host Ryan again, and we're here to discuss Ryan's journey and kind of for you guys to find out why he's here, why he's, a credible source for information, and maybe talk about some lived experience. So let's get into it.
Sounds good. I'm excited.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for, being part of this, Ryan. It's really a joy to have you here and to talk about some of these topics with you because you offer such a different perspective than I do because, I'm kind of just a normal guy, don't have any training, just kind of have studied into mental health, and you're really involved in the mental health community and being a licensed therapist. So let's talk about like where you came from and why you're here and a little bit about your history.
Sure. Maybe we'll get into the long story of this. This is my second career. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is basically the designation you have to have in California to practice legal psychotherapy. And how I got here, this is my second career, my second act. And it was quite the mental health journey sort of in between those two acts, which kind of brought me to this place. My first career was in nightlife and hospitality. I started sort of when I was, I'll back it up all the way kind of to the beginning and where kind of mental health really initially entered my life. When I was really young, I had kind of a difficult childhood. My father, while a good provider, I had a lot of rage, maybe even a little narcissism, not a lot of love to give. Okay. And kind of made for a rather unhappy childhood for myself. And when I was almost, maybe my earliest memories, I believe I was clinically depressed, probably starting, as early as at the age of 8, 9, 10. I thought about suicide back then. And I thought about the different ways I would do it. And I didn't have any of back then, mental health was not anywhere near part of our culture in the way that it is today. I feel like, especially, in the time we're at now, it's like part of almost everybody's, vocabulary or, it's mental health, diagnoses are kind of in the general lexicon. Yeah. So back then I just knew I didn't want to live and I was, really, really depressed. And thank God I had a beautiful uncle who is still my mentor today. He is a Harvard educated psychologist. He's still someone I look up to, almost more than anyone, on this planet. And he really helped me more than anything back then. And what he really did was normalize therapy for me at, kind of the age of maybe 13 or 14, which is went and saw my first therapist. And I didn't have a lot of sessions with him. I might have been like 5 or 6, but it was enough that I was able to kind of put words to the experience I was having. He was able to then also tell my parents that I was clinically depressed. And that made, quite the impact. I don't think it necessarily helped the relationship that I had with them, but I think it gave me just a way to describe my experience and therefore maybe a way to kind of work on it a little.
That's half the battle is learning how to express those things.
I probably don't give that a ton of thought these days because because I've been talking about it maybe since I was 13 and I'm 43 now. And so, but yeah, absolutely. It really being able to understand my experience. And then also that, it wasn't this, while there was definitely a lot of stigma for depression, it at least gave me some comfort that there was, a way to describe what I was going through. That being said, I looked to make family elsewhere. And kind of a side little tangent here. I lived at the time probably 4 or 5 miles from Disneyland, and our parents would
happiest place on earth.
Yeah, it created a lot of happiness for me and actually might have helped, sort of get me out of my depression. Our parents at the time, me and a whole bunch of our friends, we would get annual passports, which were only about $100 at the time.
And you can only get those if you're a Southern California resident, correct?
That was true. So
you're part of the cool
locals
club.
Pass. Yep. And our parents kind of used it as daycare in a lot of ways, just, drop them off at Disneyland. They would take turns as to who would drive. And there was in Tomorrowland, a lot of you might be familiar with Tomorrowland. there was a cover band that would play, I think almost every night during the summer, during the weekends, in the other times. And it created this big hangout for kids our age, sort of like all around the county that would come. And there would be anywhere from like 500 to like 1,500 kids that would be hanging out there, at any given time, anywhere from like
That's a lot of
12,
kids.
maybe even younger, 10, 11, all the way to, probably 18 or so. And,
That's a pretty widespread. So, I mean, I imagine that you had kind of separated because the party goers from 12 to 18 are completely different.
Well, at the time, and the reason I even brought up kind of those 11 or 12-year-olds was a lot of times like the older brother would take his little brother and you'd have this,
cool. Okay.
kind of like punk little kids. And
all right.
The coolest part about it was that it was such a welcoming, everybody was really friendly to one another. There were obviously cliques and, there was like a group of ravers, a group of goths and punks and, and everything in between. And in a lot of ways, I found a home in making friends, and I made a ton of friends while I was there. And, and I really kind of created my family outside of the family. I already had a good group of, local friends and from Garden Grove, which is where I grew up. But this really kind of expanded that horizon. And I sort of took that and ran. And next thing you know, I was sort of helping people throw their house parties, and I would, hire everyone from like the security to the DJ. Sometimes we'd go
really getting your hands into everything then.
A cleanup crew, the next morning, make sure their house looked great, for when their parents came home.
That's pretty good.
And that turned into a career in nightlife and hospitality. And
what an odd way into that.
Yeah, really, really. I mean, it really just kind of happened to me in a lot of ways. Obviously, I had kind of an entrepreneurial spirit, and I started my own clubs through a lot of different like all ages events, which then turned to like 21 and over events. And I ended up finding myself in Las Vegas when I was about 24.
Happiest place on earth for adults. So you went from Disneyland for kids to Disneyland for adults.
Mm-hmm. And I sort of became one of the bigger VIP hosts probably out there. And I was over at Tao nightclub, which at the time was really the, kind of the place to be for sure. And I was living the high life out there. That's for sure. A lot of my clients were celebrities, were whales, were, incredibly wealthy. And my job was sort of just create the party, make sure everybody had a great time and keep people spending money. I loved it. Actually, it was I don't know if things hadn't changed. I don't know that I'd still be doing it today. It really,
you might be running your own business doing it.
Definitely something like that. Yeah. But it definitely took a toll on the body. And I, 30, I was still out there, and one of my hips started hurting, and I didn't really think a whole lot of it. I was just in like an amateur boxing match. I mean, I was in pretty damn great shape and feeling invincible, really. And I didn't do anything about it. I just kind of getting worse and worse. Probably 6 months, I think. That.
Ooh, okay.
I listened to some bad advice. Well, I mean, who knew kind of what was really going on with me?
At 30, you're not going to expect something like that, to be much wrong with you. Just you're sore. You think it's just age, right?
Totally. Somebody told me it was a pulled hip flexor, which made sense. It sounded good. I heard those take a long time to heal. So, but it just kept getting worse, worse and worse. Finally got to the point, I think I couldn't walk. I had to be on crutches, and finally ended up going to the doctor. And I remember I took some x-rays. Again, wasn't thinking much of it, probably stay off of it, for a few months and you're good. He came back into the office with the x-rays, just handed me a pamphlet, what to expect when you get a total hip replacement. And
that's going to be a shock.
Total shock. I couldn't believe it, and ended up going to a handful of different doctors, all had kind of different methods to just do the same thing. And eventually just ended up getting one of my hips replaced. And then I think as they were replacing that one, they noticed that the other hip was going out. So about 6 to 8 months later, I ended up having that hip replaced. And, so during this time, I ended up moving back from Las Vegas back to my mom's guest bedroom. I was in a lot of pain. I was prescribed a lot of opiates. I was not moving very much. I was miserable, drinking a lot of alcohol. And also, in the middle of kind of losing my identity, kind of feeling like my career was slipping out of my hands. Part of me not wanting to go back to it as well. I remember we have a family friend who's an orthopedic surgeon, and he was kind of the first one to level with me and said, your life is going to be drastically different. You're not going to be able to do the same things that you were once doing. You can't be running around all over the place again. You're not going to run nightclubs, at least not in the same capacity that you were before.
And I imagine that took its toll on you because you're kind of like, at the top of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I really went from like living in a penthouse in Vegas to like living in my mom's guest bedroom. I mean, it was a drastic change of events, and it only got worse from there. I found out, well, I had kind of always known I had a lot of issues with my back, and I'm not sure if all that time in bed or what it was sort of exacerbated things for me, but I ended up having to have a spinal fusion, pretty much the same sort of fusion that Tiger Woods had. And
how long after your hip surgery was that?
Maybe like another 6 months or so.
Man, so you're just getting hammered.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, get ready for surgery, recovery, PT, time to get ready for another surgery, recovery, and then, more pain, figuring out kind of what we were going to do with my back. That surgery was just awful. We all kind of know what happened to Tiger Woods after his spinal fusion. I think it took him 4 years to really bounce back. I feel like I was in bed for at least 9 months or so and just miserable, probably taking more opiates. And I was in a real bad place. I mean, I couldn't have been more depressed, and sort of at the same time, my father took his life about 6 or 7 years kind of before all of this had happened. And a lot of, I didn't really process that a whole lot. I had just moved to Las Vegas kind of when that had happened. And I came back to Orange County, for the funeral and, to take care of things. And I maybe spent a month back down in Orange County and then went back to Las Vegas. And I really didn't have to think about it a whole lot. And so sort of being back, in the house that, he had lived and sort of kind of facing some of those demons again, this time kind of with the feeling that, I was the one in this terribly depressed place that wasn't ever going to get better. And it was a nagging thought of mine for quite some time, kind of as, each one of these sort of surgeries happened and then not feeling like I was getting any better.
Like, is this ever going to freaking end?
I mean, it really kept kind of feeling worse in a lot of ways. And the back surgery sure didn't feel like it helped. And I figured the best way out of this was to take my own life as well. It wasn't really an overnight decision. It wasn't a well thought out plan, but it wasn't. Basically waited kind of just, I don't know, for the right moment where I felt like, I guess, courage, which is not probably a good way to put it, but felt like I could go through with it. And so
now if there were people around you who had been like trained to look for the warning signs, can you see warning signs in yourself that you can think back and be like, yeah, if someone would have picked up on this, maybe, I wouldn't have been feeling this way if someone would have talked to me about it or something?
So this is a really difficult question to answer.
Okay.
I did have some people that were around. I had a psychiatrist. I remember pretty clearly sort of telling him that I didn't feel like living. I might have caged it in a way where, I wasn't dumb, that, if I were to overtly say it, there could be consequences. So, and at the same time, could he have stepped in? I don't think I had any therapists at the time.
Okay.
Could they have stepped in? Could the psychiatrist have referred other therapists? And don't think I talked about how bad I was actually feeling. I mean, I think it was evident in my behavior, but I don't think I was, if the friends I was reaching out to, I was trying to appear fine and strong.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what we all try to do, right, when we're struggling is try to be fine.
In fact, I was with a friend that night and we went down to kind of like the local bars and he had no clue, and I just asked him to kind of take me home a little later. And I think he was more than shocked, that, and him and I talked actually it was a little while. It was a while after that. And, and it might be interesting to kind of explore just this, but you and I, Sky, were kind of talking about like just kind of brushing it off or, like just pick yourself up. And he was telling me like he couldn't understand how anybody could get to a place to, do what I did. And, that he had never, been in a place like that. And again, couldn't even imagine, somebody being as low as I was to go through with something like that. Granted, I had a father who did it. I had a couple friends who had, completed as well. And so the option, and I had thought about it, since I was a kid, and so the option was very much like on the table almost at all times. And something I really encourage people to do if they are thinking about it is just to take the option off the table, at least for just a little while, while we might be able to work together. Because just having that option open, I think is what it also keeps us from really moving forward a lot too, because we always have this backdoor plan B or plan Z. At least I did. I always had, if this doesn't work out all the way, like I can just, I can just exit stage left. I can just go through with this thing and, it's no big deal. My dad did it, worked for him. And so I think that sort of being my environment. And again, we were also maybe in a place, this was 2013. So this is, over 10 years ago. I actually sort of celebrated what I call like my life day, back in March. And mental health wasn't anywhere near sort of as present in the culture as it is right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge conversation that you see a lot more these days.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is wonderful. It's about time. It's about time. And at the same time, why is also mental health getting worse and worse? Especially for our kids. I'm sure that's another topic we can really get into. But I also, was coming from a place of where we put a lot of masks on. We were Las Vegas, nightclub hosts, and I was always sort of kind of putting on some sort of face. And, as authentic as that might have been for me, it's still, we presented that we were always great. We were always the life of the party. So it's interesting now thinking back, like, that's a very different guy. And I almost don't even know how to associate with him a lot. But thinking back as to where I was and the way that I communicate with people now, and, I'm always having, deep conversations, even in my, which probably shouldn't have as many deep conversations in my personal life. But, I get to have these great, beautiful, deep conversations with clients all day long. And I don't even think I would have known how to do that, back then.
Okay.
Not in the same way and not in the same, self-reflection or introspection. So, so I guess to kind of just wrap that story up, I attempted with a firearm, didn't know how to use really a firearm, and gun safety, you keep the clip away from the bullets, away from the actual gun. And also me being somewhat inebriated, couldn't quite figure it out. And I ended up using the wrong bullet and the wrong gun, which truly saved my life. And I'm sure there's some miraculous and spiritual reasons I think that I lived too. But the physics of it is the bullet lost velocity a little, just enough, still went off and found sort of the perfect place right where my third eye is. And
so it's just sitting in there.
Maybe. We're not, I haven't gotten an x-ray. I'm assuming it is, but somebody had asked me some good questions the other day. Like, well, do you ever get any pressure? Like, I think they even asked, like, do you get a zit or anything like, and what, have you put a magnet up to it? And like all those things kind of really scare me because if it is still there, I don't want it to move, but I do have a pretty shocking x-ray of where it landed. And I guess for listeners, the reason it could very much still be there is we did nothing to extract it, or at least nobody. It found its perfect spot. Really, me being here is a miracle, but the fact that all I needed was like 20 stitches underneath my jaw and no surgical repair, that I'm not paralyzed, that, I have all my brain function, in this x-ray. I mean, it's a hair away from my skull. And
wow,
honestly, couldn't be luckier. It's been a while since I looked at the stats, but I went down a rabbit hole one night and, I think I found that it's like 1% to 2% of gunshot wounds to the head end up living a normal life afterwards. Something like that, maybe like 1 to 3%. But, and since since that happened, and since I've been in this profession now, and a handful of people, more than a handful of people know my story, but I've had people reach out to me and talk to others who have done the same thing. And unfortunately, most of those stories, people have lost their sight. People have,
Yeah. So it's crazy that it like didn't even end up in like hitting your ocular nerve or, I mean, doing some serious damage to your brain. How
yeah,
miraculous that it just kind of, I bet that it opened up a lot for you. It sits
yeah.
there, right? And
No,
I bet that
no.
kind of opened your third eye into other ways of thinking and philosophies and all that stuff.
Yeah, I've always been sort of a deep thinker and always been into meditation and spirituality and different, religions. But sure, yeah, it's and those things I'm really into these days. But metaphorically, sure, I mean it was definitely my rebirth in a lot of ways, or at least it ended up sort of being my rebirth because immediately after, or at least for like 6 months. Well, I would say actually the year after was maybe even worse than the year before. Like it was a really difficult journey immediately post attempt, and you were talking about me being lucky or something like that. I was still in the hospital. I think it was like my second or third day. And I was finally alone for like just a brief second. When you do something like this, and if you end up in the hospital, they have somebody by your side 24/7 until you are shipped off to the psych hospital. And so I was actually in the hospital for 5 days, even though they were doing nothing. I probably could have walked out the next morning had I not been put on a psychiatric hold. And so I get this moment with this doctor, and for the first time I'm asking someone, does this happen often living? And he was walking out the door and he turns around and he says, are you asking if you're lucky? And I said, sure, something like that. And he said, well, you wanted to die, right? And I said, yeah, I still do. And he said, well, then you're probably the most unlucky mother effer I've ever met in my life.
Because you didn't accomplish what you wanted.
Because I didn't know, and he was obviously, he was trying to sort of prove a point. I think he might have been right. And I definitely, in that moment, wasn't happy to still be alive. Although, there were some real hard moments immediately after. In my two little cousins came in at the same time. And, when you're either as depressed as I was, or, in that like myopic tunnel vision depression where you're only thinking about one way out and you're kind of only thinking about yourself, you're just in pain, both physically and mentally, at least I was. I didn't think about those people. And that kind of kept happening, it's like friends would come in, and that was really difficult to kind of face these people who I wasn't thinking of, but who really loved me. And something, if I'm talking to somebody else who's going through that place, it is often to like think about some of the other, if you do have people that love you, it's think about them, because.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who attempting to end their life that don't, I mean, they're thinking about what their pain is and what the things they're going through. So, it's kind of hard to think about your family members and all that mourning you, or, showing love to you when you're in this deep, dark place.
And one thing that I have kind of always understood, but also recognized when my dad completed and when, a couple of my other friends took their lives, that you don't hear it as much today, but I'm sure plenty of people still believe this, that it's such a selfish, self-absorbed thing to do. And while in many ways that there's some truth to that, sure. But for the person going through it, a lot of times, this was true with me. I know it was true with my dad. We're just feeling like we don't want to be a burden any longer. So I don't know. That's something to think about, that, I think we can be really hard on people who have attempted, or, we may have that thought about somebody who's completed, that, how could they? Let me tell you, when I was in the hospital, I had a relative walk in, to think it was like just 2 days after, and start yelling at me and telling me like I was an asshole, How could I? How basically like, how dare you? We raised you better. I mean, it was the most insensitive, harsh, and just backwards, unempathetic way of thinking. And, I think just so full of judgment that,
Yeah, and that's definitely not the healthy way to go about it.
no, and it's that when people are met with that, it's you even more so, I think in that moment I was like, well, let me show you again, kind of a thing. And so, yeah. So if anybody ever tells you that they're thinking about this at all, please meet them with empathy, with love, with support, and not judgment. So,
I know that when I was uneducated about mental health, when I first heard about my cousin dying by suicide, one of the first things I thought was how selfish. How could he do something like this to his
yeah,
family, to his friends? But I mean, the more I learned about it, the more I realized that it's not about everybody else. It's about the internal struggles. And, like you said, it's they don't want to feel like a burden anymore. And
no.
sometimes it's hard for people who haven't been through that to realize these things.
So it is
Oh,
kind of a balance of if if you know somebody who's going through something like this, to let them know that people love them, right? That and that they're not a burden, both, that they're being heard and they're being supported.
yeah, I think that's really a beautiful sentiment
Mm-hmm.
because kind of when we see someone being a way that we don't, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. When we see someone who's struggling, a lot of the times that makes us uncomfortable and it makes us kind of move away from that person and like stop hanging out and talking to that person. Did you see more of that, or did you see more of like you really found out who your real friends were after that?
I think I'm really lucky to have a lot of really good friends. Immediately after I left the hospital and ended up in a psych hospital. I was in a psych hospital in Alhambra for 10 days, I think. And it was really there that the fire inside me to become a therapist. Once I got in there, I was really advocating for others. And this was one of the few psych hospitals that would allow us to still smoke. And, there's not a whole lot to do when you're in a psych hospital. And so anytime I had a friend come, which, thank God I had quite a few friends that, came and visited me, and I'd always make them bring a carton of cigarettes, and I would give out, a pack of cigarettes to all the different clients, to the patients in there. So I don't know. I guess that's a little tangent about, sort of the good support that I had.
Yeah.
I felt incredibly, I felt a ton of shame. And if anything, I was probably pushing people away a bit at the time. I think I had, a handful of people that there was a select few, that I wanted to really come visit me. And
So I actually have a question before you move forward. Now, earlier you mentioned your uncle who was really like a mentor to you. Was he
Mhm.
around during this time, and how did that affect your relationship with him? Because I know it sounded like he was very important for a long time
Yeah.
to you.
Well, it was definitely on me that I don't think I was reaching out to him in my despair. But afterwards, he came in. So I went to a treatment center after the psych hospital, and he came and visited me once, and he said, "I'll never forget." He told me, "Ryan, there's always hope. There's always hope." And I thought it was a crock of shit at the time.
Yeah, of course.
But I now have like a little sign in at my house that says "There's always hope." And yeah, he was a good sounding board. He just would listen.
That's good.
Yeah. He was also instrumental in that time in moving forward. There were a few people who were very instrumental. So when I was in treatment, and I have no problem saying I was in a terrible treatment center, this is also the time where, treatment centers were just, probably fully unregulated. All sorts of people were popping them up all over the place, and they weren't really providing a whole lot of treatment. Now it's a whole, at least regulation here in California is completely different when it comes to the way these places are managed. They were taking advantage of me and taking advantage of my family. At one point we had somebody sort of pit me against my brother. And, and actually when you talk about, sort of some of the friends that might have distanced, there were some friends that I think pulled away and, maybe knowing that, I was in a psych hospital or that I was in, a treatment center, there were definitely a lot more though that were there for me. And so,
That's good.
but I did have a group therapist that happens to be, kind of one of these therapist influencers. I think he's actually written he's an author and he's got a lot of good stuff to say. His name's John Kim, and he's the Angry Therapist, I think, on Instagram, and kind of his brand. He happened to be my group therapist when I first got to this treatment center. And I think, I had like 5 or 6 groups with him or so. But I'd get to talk to him afterwards, and he really pushed me. He actually promised me that if I, applied to grad school and I got, to be an associate, that he would hire me. I completely forgot about that until like the night before I got licensed. But during the time, it was definitely that motivation. I had another therapist outside of the treatment center. And then I also had my uncle, who were all really rooting and pushing. I have an amazing cousin who was really pushing, a couple of them who were really pushing for me to apply. And so I applied to grad school while I was there. And that was sort of my ticket out in a lot of ways. And so I ended up enrolling in Pepperdine, it was probably 6 months, sort of 6 or 7 months after that event and that I started. And
wow, that's not very long in between.
No, it wasn't, but I had to do something. And
yeah, what a quick change.
Yeah. I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of resentment towards people, towards the treatment center, towards even myself, that things had kind of gotten to where they were. And so I had a lot of fire inside. I was, pretty motivated. I found somebody to live with in Malibu, right on the water. I was, it was definitely a quick transition from the treatment center. I ended up moving back down to Orange County, and I moved in with my best friend down here. I was living there for 3 months while I was going to Pepperdine down here. He ended up passing away while we were living together there. And that was another like real huge hurdle, kind of like right as I was getting, my legs under me again, that happened. And, but through all of these things, and especially kind of going to grad school, while I was going through that, I really was taking in everything I was learning about psychology and all the different like modalities of therapy, and seeing which ones, I could really kind of apply to myself, or which ones made sense. And, if you go to grad school for clinical psychology, you really are, a lot of the classes have you do a lot of, self-reflection in a lot of the work. I know some programs make you go to therapy. As part of our clinical hours, we could use therapy as, a way to kind of get like 300 extra hours if we, sort of documented, or at least just kept track of our own individual personal therapy that we were doing. And so I did a lot of work, sort of on myself going through there. And, especially like our trauma class, I felt like every week I was having to write another 2 or 3 page paper, maybe probably more than that, about my own trauma. And yeah, man, that was a hard class for just about anybody to go through, but, to be reflecting, over and over and over again. But
can I ask, how prevalent was it in like amongst the population of students that you were with at Pepperdine? How prevalent was it that someone came from a traumatic experience, maybe not as traumatic as your experience, but like, did you find that a lot of like people were there because they had traumatic experience, or because someone they love had traumatic experience? Was there like a balance to that?
I don't know, but a lot, I would say a lot.
Okay.
I don't want to reinforce the stigma that, there is this stigma that therapists, are all kind of, are all going through their own shit, or,
I'm just curious, the questions just come and pop in my brain. I'm like, okay, I got to ask that.
Yeah. And there were definitely a lot of people who chose this path for a reason, right? Like either therapy helped them a lot. I don't think, people necessarily were going to grad school to work through things. I think that was definitely just a byproduct. But I definitely think, the people I think who were most passionate though, had probably endured some real trauma in their own lives and really, wanted to make a difference.
I think that's how you can tell the difference of people who care a little bit more and don't care a little bit more, is unfortunately, sometimes we have to go through things in order to grow and change. So there's more motivation for you to be kind and loving and supportive instead of just being, okay, this is the clinical answer.
I will say, and no offense to the, younger therapists who are like just or younger grad students who are just getting out of their bachelor's, there was definitely a difference in, I think, the way people with more life experience were approaching grad school versus, some of the others, or at least, you could maybe see that a bit clinically. And the way we approached grad school, I think. I was 33 when I had started. There were some people who were, 23, 24, but being 33, I felt like I'd had the life experience, 7-year-old at this point. So
how has that benefited your life, having that lived experience and having that, experience going to college and coming out this other side and kind of living this whole other life?
It's crazy when I like I said, I had my sort of 10-year anniversary of that just back in March. And I have no idea almost who that guy was in regards to the way I feel about life and my passion for this work now and versus the despair that I was in there. I have an old mentor who just wrote a book called When Grief is Good. And I think, that's really the goal when we're going through trauma, or at least, at some point, is to get to a place where we can look back at this traumatic event or events and be able to put a new narrative around it that isn't, despair, right? And that, now I can look back and be like, it was that struggle. It was that depression. It was, that the lowest points, that I found resilience eventually, that I learned some skills that, now I can look back and because of all of these different traumatic events that I've been through, that I can now use that to relate to people. And I can, come from a place of understanding and know what it's like, and so to be able to really just, I think even better, meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, man, I'm so honored to have you here as my new co-host. And I'm so honored to have you on this podcast because I feel like your experience brings a light of credibility and brings a light of hope more than I could give by myself. So, thanks for sharing your story and thank you so much for being here with me. I really, I can't wait to get to know you a little bit better and as, this progresses and we do a little bit more of stuff together.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been fun. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know if the story was so fun today, but
I think
this project has been fun.
That's the point of this, right? Is to have some of those uncomfortable situations so that we can, end the stigma together, or at least fight the stigma together.
Yeah.
Because it's so important to do that. Because if people don't know they can talk, talking is, so important.
Yeah. And I know we're wrapping up here, but I feel like I spent a lot of time on, the harder times in my life where I'm at now, is I have a private practice in Newport Beach. I get to work with some of the coolest clients. I couldn't be more fortunate. I couldn't be happier. I couldn't be any more grateful to be alive. And that's really kind of my message more than anything. It's that, you can eventually get to this place. I couldn't have even dreamed, the point where I was at, where I attempted to take my life. I have no idea, that this would end up, where I'm at. And I wouldn't want to go through it again. That's for damn sure. But, boy,
I feel you.
Am I lucky? And yeah, man, there is sort of, a light at the end of the tunnel sometimes in life. And if we just, sometimes it is just putting one foot in front of the other, but sometimes, we have to reach out for support. Sometimes it's up to our friends to really help the ones, that are going through it. I think kind of the responsibility lies on all of us, to lift each other up. So I think we all have to go through adversity and difficulty. And I guarantee if you've, made it to 30 or 40, you've probably gone through, a few hardships. But I hope that we can help one another so that we don't have to get to a place where we put our lives on the line. Yeah.
And if you yourself, if anyone is listening or watching and you're struggling with, thoughts of suicide and thoughts of, not wanting to be here on this earth anymore, please reach out and talk to somebody. Whether that be a friend, whether that be a therapist, call the 988 suicide hotline. They press 1 if you're a veteran and it'll go right to the veterans suicide hotline. It's so important to talk about it. and know that there's people out there who are going to support you and help get you through the problem today.
Yeah. At least in Orange County, we have a couple like great resources. I think there's one like California Family Institute, another one called Living Success Center, and they offer low to no cost therapy. And there's almost always somebody out there who's willing to help. And I can't advocate for therapy more than I mean, it's
you're not biased or anything.
Not biased at all. No. And I have therapy tomorrow morning, my own session, and I look forward to that. Find a therapist that you like. If you have to go through a few, that's totally okay. But man, I mean, it's still something. I'm always working on something. I'm always trying to grow in one way or another. And I think we all should.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate your story and, your journey and sharing that with us, because it's just, it's not often you get to talk to somebody who attempted suicide and lived through it to tell the tales.
Well, again, I am more than grateful and lucky to the stars, the universe, the source, God, all of the above, to be here and to be getting to do what I get to do and to talk to you, Sky. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
cool. Well, I mean, here we are. We're at the end of the episode.
Thank you all for listening today. Again, my name is Ryan Heapy. This is my co-host, Sky. Yep. And we are the Hey Man, It's Okay podcast. Please like, subscribe, reach out, engage with us. If you liked what I said, if you hated what I said, let us know. Let us know. If you have any suggestions for us, if you want to find a way to, find other support out there, reach out. But again, thank you guys.
We're on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all under Hey Man, It's Okay. So until next time, remember, it's okay to not be okay. See you later.